Well, according to the convention program, I'm supposed to be speaking on the subject, why Jehovah's Witnesses speak their own language. So I will talk about that a little bit, but mostly I'm going to talk about the new light that the Watchtower has come up with in their October 15th and November 1st, 1995 Watchtower magazines. This involves the prophecy about the generation of 1914. This prophecy has appeared in every issue of The Awake for many years now, but it's dropped in the November 8th, 1995 Awake magazine. So if you're taking notes on this talk, or if you're making a tape, you might want to change the title. We're going to be speaking about the new light on the 1914 generation. Now, this is the most important prophetic failure yet on the part of the Watchtower organization, I believe. I believe this is even more important than the 1975 failure. And there are two reasons for that. Number one, this prophecy that the end would come before the generation that saw 1914 passes away, this prophecy was repeated over and over and over again in Watchtower publications. It was published more often than any of the Society's previous prophecies about 1914, 1925, 1975, or any of these other prophecies. The second reason I think this is the most important prophetic failure yet on the part of the Watchtower is that the Society has used an excuse in regard to previous prophecies. They've said that they made a mistake, what they said didn't come true, but they said they were not a false prophet, because never did they say, "These are the words of Jehovah." Now, that's a quote from the Awake magazine. I'll identify just where later on when we talk about it in more detail. But the Society has used that as an excuse for previous prophetic failures. They said, these failures don't make us a false prophet because we never made these predictions in the name of Jehovah. Well, in the case of this prophecy about the 1914 generation, the Society did. In each issue of the Awake magazine, they said this was the Creator's promise. That's a direct quote, the Creator's promise. And we'll look at that quote in more detail later. And they also said in the May 15th, 1984 Watchtower, which we'll talk about more specifically later, they said that this prophecy, that the end would come before the generation that saw 1914 passed away, they said that this prophecy was, quote, Jehovah's prophetic word, unquote. That's very, very important, because this wipes out the excuse that the Watchtower Society has offered in the past, saying that they're not a false prophet, because they did speak this prophecy in Jehovah's name, and they said that it was, quote, Jehovah's prophetic word, unquote. In fact, they also added in that same Watchtower, they said, quote, Jehovah, who is the source of inspired and unfailing prophecy, will bring about the fulfillment, unquote. Now, we'll look more closely at both of those statements in a couple of minutes. But first, though, I did say I was going to speak on the subject originally, why Jehovah's Witnesses speak their own language. But I'll leave most of that for this booklet that I prepared, a Dictionary of JWEs, to explain. Hopefully, this booklet right now is just a 44-page booklet stapled together. Hopefully, in about a year or so, it's going to be a full-length book, a dictionary of the language that Jehovah's Witnesses use. Well, how does this tie in with the new light about the 1914 generation? Well, it ties in because the October and November 1995 Watchtowers that bring out this new light use this JWE's language to explain the new light. For example, the Watchtower of October 15th, 1995, on page 19, it refers to the new light as an adjusted understanding. And it also calls it on the same page, this deeper understanding. On page 23, it says, this clarifies our understanding. And the November 1st, 1995 Watchtower on page 20 refers to it as our more precise viewpoint. Well, if you take these words that they've used here, an adjusted understanding, a deeper understanding, a clarified understanding, a more precise viewpoint, and if you look these expressions up in the dictionary, what you come up with is a minor adjustment, just fine-tuning something a little bit. That's what it means when you have a more precise viewpoint, an adjusted understanding, a deeper understanding. But actually, it's a totally different understanding. They threw the old one away and came in with a new one. So this is why I call it JWEs. It's a different kind of language. It's a language designed to hide what they're actually doing and make it look like they're doing something else. This type of language is designed to be deceptive. It's designed to hide the magnitude of the change that the society's made here in its prophecy. This plays a role in mind control, and it's explained in this dictionary of JWEs how language is an important, recognized part of mind control. Mind control authorities, even secular authorities like Steve Hassan, who wrote the book Combating Cult Mind Control, he speaks about loaded language as an important element of mind control. If you've ever heard of loaded dice, they're dice that when you throw them, they don't just come up with numbers by chance, but they're predetermined to come out to certain numbers. Well, loaded language is language that has a predetermined influence on a person. It's not just ordinary language. It's language designed to mold and shape thinking and lean thought in a certain direction. Well, this is part of mind control. If we have time, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the most important thing right now is the new light that the Watchtower has just come up with in the October and November magazines. So probably the simplest thing to do is to go through this new light step by step in the order that it's appeared in the Society's publications. Now, if you have the October 15th Watchtower and the subsequent magazines, you might want to mark them. If you have photocopies, you might want to mark those. These are all documented in this booklet, The 1914 Generation, Prophecy Proves False. So if you don't have the magazines, you can always catch up on this later. You don't have to start scrambling now to make detailed notes. But the first study article in the October 15th Watchtower, well, actually, I'm going to talk a little bit more than what's in this booklet, so you might want to take a few notes. This first study article in the October 15th, 1995 Watchtower is titled, "Why Fear the True God Now?" And this article tells what has not changed. And I think the reason the Society put this article in there is so the witnesses who started reading the new truth, so-called, wouldn't immediately think that the Society has dropped everything in regard to 1914, because they haven't. There are some things that have not changed. The article starts on page 9, and it continues for quite a while, but the main points are found on pages 12 and 13. And it points out there in paragraph 17 on page 12, it says, "In line with Revelation 14:6 and 7, mankind now is hearing a warning message of judgment declared by Jehovah's Witnesses under angelic direction." And in paragraph 18, it continues and says, "It is true that angels are involved in this preaching work." Or is it true that angels are involved in this preaching work? Then it answers, well, it certainly seems clear that angelic guidance has often brought Jehovah's Witnesses to a door where some distressed soul was yearning for help, or yearning, even praying for spiritual help. So they're still saying that angels are involved. Now that's important because the new truth that they come out with affects the specific involvement with the angels in their preaching work. So they're pointing out to Jehovah's Witnesses here that they're still teaching that angels are involved in their preaching work. And then on page 13, they say, in paragraph 21, this is the type of people that Jehovah is now gathering and preparing to come out of the Great Tribulation that ends this system. And further down in the same paragraph, it says, according to all the available evidence, Jehovah's chosen ruler, Jesus Christ, has been ruling as king since the critical year 1914. This means that the time left is fast running out for individuals. So they're pointing out here, too, that they're still teaching that they're gathering people. They're still teaching that 1914 is when Christ returned invisibly to become king, and they're still teaching that time is running out fast. But now we come to the new light. It's in the next article. In the October 15th, 1995 Watchtower, the article is entitled, "How Will You Stand Before the Judgment Seat?" And as a subtitle of the article, it quotes Matthew 25:31. "When the Son of Man arrives in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit down on his glorious throne." So what this article is devoted to is changing the Society's interpretation of this verse, Matthew 25:31. And right there on page 18, where it introduces this article, it also mentions the parable of the sheep and the goats, and starts pointing out that they've changed their view of that parable. So on the next page, page 19, paragraph 4, is a critical one. I'll read the whole paragraph right from the Watchtower. It says, "We have long felt that the parable depicted Jesus sitting down as king in 1914, and since then making judgments, everlasting life for people proving to be like sheep, permanent death for the goats. But a reconsideration of the parable points to an adjusted understanding of its timing and what it illustrates. This refinement reinforces the importance of our preaching work and the significance of people's response. To see the basis for this deeper understanding of the parable, let us consider what the Bible shows about Jehovah and Jesus, both as kings and as judges." So they're announcing right here in paragraph 4 that they're coming up with a new understanding. But again, they call it a refinement, as if it's just a slight change, but it's really quite different. Then again on page 21, they reinforce that they're not changing certain basic things. They say in paragraph 16, "Jehovah's Witnesses have published much evidence that Jesus' period of waiting expired in 1914 when he became ruler of God's kingdom in the invisible heavens." And in that same paragraph they continue, "The wars, earthquakes, pestilences, food shortages, and the like that we have seen since 1914 confirm that Jesus is now ruling in God's kingdom and the world's final end is near." So they keep repeating that they still think that we're close to the end, and the 1914 is a significant year, but they are changing things. In paragraph 21, they again start talking about the parable of the sheep and the goats. And this is on page 22 of the October 15th, 1995 Watchtower. Now they come up with an important question here in paragraph 22. They say, "Does this parable apply when Jesus sat down in kingly power in 1914 as we have long understood?" Well, the answer is no. In fact, not only are they changing the definition of this parable, but in that same paragraph, at the end of the paragraph, they say, "Yet nothing indicates that at that time, or for that matter since, Jesus sat down to judge people of all the nations finally as sheep or goats." Well, that's interesting that nothing indicates that, because that's what they've been teaching for the last many years. It might have been easier if they said, well, there's a lot that seems to make it look this way, but we found some other things that make it look that way. But no, they're very radically said, nothing indicates that that's what that verse means. So they must have been teaching whatever they were teaching up until now based on nothing. Strange. Apparently what happens when they come out with new teachings like this is someone on the governing body has now become the majority. It's just like what's happened with the United States government here with a Republican majority in Congress instead of a Democratic majority. Well, all of a sudden, the people who passed the former laws are out, the ones who are passing the new laws are in, and they don't think very highly of the ones who passed the old laws. Well, this is what we evidently have on the governing body, either a new majority, a new someone else in control, someone else running things, someone else making the decisions. And so they don't think very highly of the former majority that came out with the old truth. So they can come out here and say, nothing indicates that was the time when Jesus sat down to judge people. Now in paragraph 23, they go on and they say, this parable does not show that such judging would continue over an extended period of many years. Now that's exactly what Jehovah's Witnesses had been teaching. When I became a witness, I was told that when I went from house to house, I was having a share in fulfilling that parable. Jesus returned in 1914. He sat down on his throne and he started separating sheep from goats. And as we went knocking on the doors, we were helping to do that work. The angels were directing us, and we were having a part in separating the sheep from the goats. Well, now they say that parable does not show that such judging would continue over an extended period of many years. So all the Jehovah's Witnesses for all these years have been going knocking on doors thinking that they were helping to separate the sheep from the goats. They weren't doing that. It wasn't happening. Paragraph 24 on page 22 of the October 15th, 1995 Watchtower, they continue and they say, in other words, the parable points to the future when the Son of Man will come in his glory. He will sit down to judge people then living. In paragraph 25, they say, this means then that Jesus sitting down on his glorious throne for judgment mentioned at Matthew 25:31 applies to the future point when this powerful king will sit down to pronounce and execute judgment on the nations. So that's the new truth. In the October 15th Watchtower, there's another one coming in the next issue. But this first new truth is the change in their interpretation of Matthew 25:31. They no longer say it applies to Jesus sitting down as king in 1914. It applies to the future when he sits down as judge at Armageddon. On page 23, they continue in paragraph 26, and to make sure that you understand it, they say, understanding the parable of the sheep and the goats in this way indicates that the rendering of judgment on the sheep and the goats is future. It will take place after the tribulation mentioned at Matthew 24:29 and 30 breaks out and the Son of Man arrives in his glory. And then they explain it in paragraph 27 by saying, this clarifies our understanding of the timing of Jesus' parable, which shows when the sheep and the goats will be judged. Well, now we come to the third study article on page 23 of the October 15th Watchtower. This article is titled, What Future for the Sheep and the Goats? And they go on for page after page after page, but not saying anything too significant. But on page 28, they sort of sum it up, and they say at the end of paragraph 22 that people around the globe are responding to the message proclaimed by Jesus' brothers, that is, the anointed remnant, the leaders of the Watchtower. And they sum it up in paragraph 24, the last paragraph of this article, where they say the point is that those responding and actively supporting the remnant of Christ's brothers are thereby now giving evidence that will provide a basis for them to be placed on Jesus' right hand when, in the near future, he sits down on his throne to render judgment. So that's the October 15th Watchtower. That's the new truth that it contains. Now, you can imagine that Jehovah's Witnesses were beginning to get shaken up when they received this magazine and read it, especially those who believed, as long as they've been witnesses, because they were teaching this back in 1968 when I became a witness, those who believed that they were separating sheep and goats by going from house to house under angelic direction. So witnesses began to get shaken up at that time. Now, the October 22nd Awake magazine came out, and that still contained that prophecy about the generation of 1914. But then came the November 1st Watchtower. This is the one with a picture of an angel on the front cover asking, what can angels do for you? Well, on page 6, we see some important points. I'm going to mention a few other important points. If you have that November 1st, 1995 Watchtower, it's really a collector's item. You don't want to let go of it. In fact, if you can find a Jehovah's Witness going door to door, maybe they'll give you a copy for a donation. But there are several interesting points. Before we look at the new truth contained in that issue, there's some other points you might want to mark in it. On page 6, for example, this isn't one of the study articles, but in the first column on page 6, it says, so inquiring of the dead, or seemingly receiving messages from them, is yet another facet of the angel movement that is not approved by God. Well, that's an interesting point, that receiving messages from the dead is a facet of the angel movement that is not approved by God. The reason that quote would be useful is that you can use it when discussing the claim that was made in 1917 that Pastor Russell controls the organization from beyond the grave. That was a Watchtower teaching in 1917, that Pastor Russell, who had died the previous October, was still running the organization from beyond the grave. That claim is found in the Finished Mystery, which was published in 1917, Volume 7 of Studies in the Scriptures. And commenting on Revelation chapter 8, verse 3, this commentary published by the Watchtower Society called the Finished Mystery, it said on page 144, this verse, that is Revelation 8, verse 3, it says, this verse shows that though Pastor Russell has passed beyond the veil, he is still managing every feature of the harvest work. So the Society was teaching them that though Russell had died the previous October, and they believed that he was gone to heaven, he was beyond the veil, he was beyond the grave, he was still running the organization. They said the same thing in the November 1st, 1917 Watchtower. On page 6161 of the Society's reprints, it says, hence our dear pastor, now in glory, is without doubt manifesting a keen interest in the harvest work, and is permitted by the Lord to exercise some strong influence thereupon. So the late Pastor Russell, from the grave, was influencing the Watchtower's work, according to that teaching. But this isn't just an old teaching. It was done away with in regard to Pastor Russell in 1934 when J.F. Rutherford's book Jehovah condemned that teaching. Rutherford wrote on page 191, "No one of the temple company will be so foolish as to conclude that some brother or brethren at one time amongst them and who has died and gone to heaven is now instructing the saints on earth and directing them as to their work." Well, again, the society is very roughly and abusively denouncing the previous teaching that it itself had been promoting. So Rutherford put an end to that teaching in regard to the idea that Russell was directing the work from heaven. He didn't need Russell's departed spirit to help him anymore. He was firmly in control by 1934, and so could dispense with that teaching. But the reason this is of special interest to Jehovah's Witnesses to use this point from the November 1st, 1995 Watchtower is that the Society revived that teaching again later on, not just in regard to Pastor Russell, but in regard to a large number of their dead anointed leaders who they say have gone to heaven. And this is found in their current publication, Revelation, Its Grand Climax at Hand. That's a 1988 publication that Witnesses are still using. And this does contain a similar reference to the Society receiving communications from the dead. On page 125, this book, Revelation, Its Grand Climax at Hand, it says, quote, "It is fitting, then, that one of the 24 elders representing anointed ones already in heaven should stir John's thinking by asking a pertinent question." And then it continues in this paragraph and says, "This suggests that resurrected ones of the 24 elders group may be involved in the communicating of divine truths today." So that teaching found on page 125 of the Revelation Climax book shows that the Society believes that some of its new truths today are coming from dead members of the anointed class who've gone to heaven. So the statement in the November 1st Watchtower condemns what the Society says it might be its source for some of its new truths. Well, that becomes rather complicated when a new truth is coming from a source that the Society says is condemned because it's a source from communication from the dead. But that's an interesting point in the November 1st Watchtower. You might want to mark that one out before you get to the new truths in that issue. There's another new point on page 8 of the November 1st Watchtower. Not a new point, but an interesting point that's worth noting. There's a discussion there on who are the angels, and it's in one of these little boxes that they've highlighted on that page 8 of the November 1st, 1995 Watchtower. It says, "The foremost angel, both in power and authority, is the archangel, Jesus Christ, also called Michael." So that's a statement that you can use when discussing the question of who Jesus is with Jehovah's Witnesses. The Society says that he's the foremost angel. And of course, the best refutation of that is an inspired refutation. It's the Hebrews chapter 1 in God's inspired word. And if you read Hebrews chapter 1, it makes it very clear that Jesus Christ is not an angel. Two more points from the November 1st Watchtower that are worth making note of because you'll be able to use them. One is on page 25. Actually, both of these are on page 25. There's a testimony of a witness, an elderly witness there, and he's giving his personal testimony. And at the top of page 25, he says, "I have learned to view Jehovah as my father and his organization as my mother." Mother is capitalized, just like father. So, again, that's page 25 of the November 1st, 1995 Watchtower. The organization is elevated to the level of a goddess, a female god. Person is quoted here with approval of the organization as saying that he views Jehovah as his father and the organization as his mother. Now, the final point that I'll mention before the new truth in this issue, this November 1st Watchtower, you can see, is a real treasure trove of quotations here. Beginning on page 25, right under that statement about God's organization being the mother with a capital M, there's an article titled, "Comfort for Those with a Stricken Spirit." And this article is about judicial cases in Jehovah's Witness congregations involving sexual abuse of children, and in particular cases involving repressed memories of sexual abuse of children. If our reporter from the Fifth Estate in Canada is still here today, that she might be interested in that particular article because it relates to what she's doing some research on. But in any case, this article goes on for 4 pages, instructing elders in Jehovah's Witness congregations how to deal with these cases. Evidently, the Watchtower is having a serious problem of people reporting repressed memories of sexual abuse within the congregation. And so the elders are having to deal with this, and the Society's devoted 4 pages of the Watchtower to telling them how to do it. Well, now let's get on to the new light. But the reason I quoted all those other things is that if you have the Watchtower of November 1st, 1995, you don't want to just tear out the pages of the new light and keep those. You want to keep that whole magazine. But there's lots of information in there. We'll look first at the article in the November 1st, 1995 Watchtower, starting on page 10. The article is titled, Saved from a Wicked Generation. And on page 11, it quotes Jesus' statement in Matthew 24, verse 34, "This generation will by no means pass away until all these things occur." Now, what the Society is doing here is they're going to redefine what that means. They're going to reinterpret what Jesus meant. And so at the bottom of page 11, there's a bold heading that asks, "This generation, what is it?" Well, they go on rather long-windedly for a while here before they actually come up with the answer. And again, on page 14, they still haven't identified it because they have a bold heading titled, "This Generation Identified." Then on page 15, they finally get to the point. And they're talking about today in paragraph 21. And about halfway through that paragraph, they identify the generation as the wayward people who make up this contemporary, wicked, and adulterous generation. Now, that doesn't fully define it yet. They leave that for the next article, starting on page 16, titled, "A Time to Keep Awake." And in this article, on page 17, is where they finally get around to defining their new truth, in paragraph 6. And I'll read a large portion of that paragraph where it defines this. And they're also confessing again here to their previous error in misinterpreting the verse. Quote, eager to see the time of this evil system, eager to see the end of this evil system, Jehovah's people have at times speculated about the time when the Great Tribulation would break out, even tying this to calculations of what is the lifetime of a generation since 1914. However, we bring a heart of wisdom in, not by speculating about how many years or days make up a generation, but by thinking about how we count our days and bringing joyful praise to Jehovah, Psalm 90, verse 12. Rather than provide a rule for measuring time, the term generation as used by Jesus refers principally to contemporary people of a certain historical period with their identifying characteristics. End of quote. So that one sentence is the main new truth. If you want to summarize it in one sentence, is this the one where the Watchtower of November 1st, 1975 on page 17 says, rather than provide a rule for measuring time, the term generation as used by Jesus refers principally to contemporary people of a certain historical period with their identifying characteristics. So what they're doing is they're detaching this generation from the year 1914. It becomes a sort of a floating generation of contemporaries that floats around, sort of like the, if you think about the, something just floating, detached, not nailed down to any date at all. Now going on again on page 19, they say in paragraph 12, therefore, in the final fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy today, this generation apparently refers to the peoples of earth who see the sign of Jesus' presence but fail to mend their ways. So again, it doesn't attach itself anymore to the people that saw 1914 still being alive when the world's end would come. They're throwing out that idea altogether. Now they discuss the implications of this on page 20. They realize, of course, this is going to change a lot of their thinking. And in paragraph 15, they have a question at the bottom of the page that asks, why should we not think that Armageddon is further away than we may have believed? Well, that's an interesting question because that's just what they are doing. They're trying to get people to think that Armageddon is further away than they believed. But they still want them to keep it close because otherwise they'll stop going house to house selling watchtowers. Well, the answer to the question is in paragraph 15 there on page 20. They say, does our more precise viewpoint on this generation mean that Armageddon is further away than we had thought? Not at all. Though we had no time of knowing the day and hour, Jehovah God has always known it, and he does not change. Well, as far as the society is concerned, that's the significance of their new truth. Armageddon is still close, but we don't know when it is, and God knows. Well, to get a little fuller understanding of the implications of this new truth, the teachings of these two Watchtower magazines, I'm going to turn to my booklet on the 1914 generation, Prophecy Proves False, because I've sort of got it in the order that makes sense in explaining it in there. First of all, the thing to notice is that the Awake magazine has contained this prophecy for many, many years. In recent years, it's been on page 4 as part of the masthead of each issue of the Awake. That's where they list who publishes the magazine, why it's published, and that sort of thing. And in each issue of the magazine, it said, quote, "The Creator's promise of a peaceful and secure new world before the generation that saw the events of 1914 passes away." So that's the false prophecy. They were presenting this as the Creator's promise. And they've presented it very clearly over the years. And in talking to a Jehovah's Witness about this, it would be worth it to collect together some of the evidence that they've stated this prophecy, that they've said it was the Creator's promise, and just what they said. Because witnesses are going to try to dance around this every way that they can, because they don't want to admit that their organization's a false prophet. A very good visual picture of it, if you're dealing with someone who doesn't get into a lot of words and complicated concepts, is the May 15th, 1984 Watchtower. That's about 11 years ago, May 15th, 1984 Watchtower. I've reproduced the cover of it on this booklet, and it shows a group of old people looking hopefully off to the side, and it says, 1914, the generation that will not pass away. So you have a very visual image of it as these elderly people who saw 1914, and they are the generation that will not pass away. This is old light. This is now false in the eyes of Jehovah's Witnesses. So if you can pull out a copy of that May 15th, 1984 Watchtower magazine, the cover picture is false. It's no longer being taught. It's old light. But actually, ever since the 1940s, Awake magazine had been promising what it said was, quote, "the sure hope for the establishment of a righteous new world." Now that appeared on page 2 of the Awake magazine since the late 1940s. Then in 1964, it changed that prophecy a little bit. It was no longer just the sure hope for the establishment of a righteous new world, but in 1964, it changed it to, quote, "in this generation." That was introduced in 1964. Then in 1975, it was refined a little bit more, and this time they said, "the Creator's promise." So it was in the January 8th, 1975 Awake that for the first time that expression appeared, and it said, quote, "the Creator's promise of a new order of lasting peace and true security within our generation." So again, it still wasn't too specific. It was one of these floating generations, this generation, our generation, like the word today. Today is today. Well, tomorrow will be today, and the next day, that day will be today. So whenever you're talking in the present tense, it's always this generation, our generation. But of course, they were speaking in 1964 when they said in this generation. And they were speaking in 1975 when they said it was the Creator's promise that this would happen in our generation. And it's documented here in the booklet. There are actual photocopies of these pages referenced where these things are said. Now, it was a very serious step in 1975 for the Society to add that statement, "the Creator's promise," to their prophecy, because that meant that they were now prophesying in the Creator's name. Before that, it was the Awake magazine's promise. Now, and since 1975, it has been the Creator's promise. The reason that's so serious is because of what it says in the Bible at Deuteronomy 18:20 through 22. God said, "But a prophet who presumes to speak in my name anything I have not commanded him to say, or a prophet who speaks in the name of other gods, must be put to death. You may say to yourselves, how can we know when a message has not been spoken by the Lord, if what a prophet proclaims in the name of the Lord does not take place or come true? That is a message the Lord has not spoken. That prophet has spoken presumptuously, Do not be afraid of him. So God made reference to prophets speaking in his name, something that would not come true. He said the prophet deserved death, the prophet was acting presumptuously, and we shouldn't be afraid of him or feel that we need to listen to anything he tells us. So the society specified after this, not only that their prophecy was in the Creator's name, but after 1975 they made another change in the Awake. But this change had actually been made earlier, before they put it into the masthead of the Awake. And way back in October 8th, 1968, the Awake magazine contained this change in one of its articles on pages 13 and 14. And there the society specified precisely what generation they were talking about. This is very important, because this shows very clearly that their prophecy proved false. On page 13 and 14 of the October 8th, 1968 Awake, they said, quote, Jesus was obviously speaking about those who are old enough to witness with understanding what took place when the last days began. Then further on they said, even if we presume that youngsters 15 years of age would be perceptive enough to realize the import of what happened in 1914, it would still make the youngest of this generation nearly 70 years old today. That was in 1968. And they continued saying, Jesus said that the end of this wicked world would come before that generation passed away in death. So they're not saying that this was our calculation or our interpretation, but Jesus said that. People who were old enough to realize what was happening in 1914. Well, it was in 1982 that the Society changed the Awake magazine to actually put this prophecy into the masthead of each issue on page 2 at that time. Later they changed the masthead to page 4, but at that time it was on page 2. And so in the January 8th, 1982 Awake on page 2, you find for the first time, quote, the Creator's promise of a peaceful and secure new order before the generation that saw the events of 1914 CE passes away. And that was in 1982 that they began putting that in each Awake magazine. Now, nearly identical wording appeared in each Awake on page 2 until January 8th, 1987, when the Awake magazine statement of purpose was moved to page 4. The masthead was moved to page 4, and that statement of purpose about this generation no longer appeared. It was dropped, January 8th, 1987. Now, a lot of us who followed the Watchtower and what they were doing noticed that. It was a very noticeable thing to drop that prophecy. We wondered, were they going to give up the prophecy? Well, they left it out until the March 8th, 1988 issue came out, and they put it back in. And again, they said, quote, the Creator's promise of a peaceful and secure new world before the generation that saw the events of 1914 passes away. And that wording continued from March 8th, 1988 until the October 1995 issues that just came out this month. But now we come out with the new light. And the new light is that this generation, obviously, has passed away. People who were about 70 years old in 1968 would be about 97 years old now. The generation's gone. That prophecy that continued to appear in each issue of the Awake right up through this month, October 1995, that prophecy had passed its shelf life. It was like spoiled food. Would you buy a carton of milk that said sell before July 1995? Here it is, October. If you brought that milk into your house, it would stink. Well, that's what happened with this prophecy. It was like spoiled food. I mean, witnesses had to open each issue of the Awake magazine, and here was this prophecy that stunk. You know, it said that the world would end before the generation that saw 1914 passed away, and everybody knew it had passed away. And here it is. They're reading this prophecy that already proved false in each issue. Well, they finally decided to get rid of the smelling prophecy, and the November 8th, 1995 Awake drops that prophecy. They reword it. On page 4, the November 8th, 1995 Awake says, the Creator's promise of a peaceful and secure new world that is about to replace the present wicked, lawless system of things. So they've totally dropped any reference to the generation of 1914 as of this November 8th Awake magazine. Now, when you look at this Awake magazine, what it was saying before, and review it with Jehovah's Witnesses, you can mention that this was not an insignificant statement that appeared in each Awake. If you look at, for example, the October magazines, it says on page 4, this under Awake, it says, "Why Awake is published." That was why they were publishing it. And they started the sentence by saying, "Most important, this magazine builds confidence in the Creator's promise of a peaceful and secure new world before the generation that saw the events of 1914 passes away." So this was most important, according to the Awake magazine itself. This was the reason why the magazine was published, to contain that statement in each issue. So this was not an insignificant prophecy that failed. This was the most important reason why they were publishing the Awake, according to Awake itself. So now we come to the October 15th Watchtower that reinterprets the separating of the sheep and goats. It changes the time when Jesus sat down on his glorious throne, and it says that since Christ returned and sat down on his heavenly throne, all humankind has been on judgment. Well, this is what the Society used to say. If you turn to the 1982 book, You Can Live Forever in Paradise on Earth, in its original edition, on page 183, it says, "Yes, since Christ returned and sat down on his heavenly throne, all humankind has been on judgment. During the present judgment, people are being separated as sheep or goats. People are being separated as goats to Christ's left hand or as sheep to his right." So that's a very clear statement of what the Society had been teaching right up until now. It's found on page 183 of the 1982 book, You Can Live Forever in Paradise on Earth. And it said that this judgment of the sheep and the goats was a present judgment, and it was going on since Christ returned. So now we've seen that the October 15th Watchtower of this year changes that, and the change here is twofold. It changes, number one, Christ sitting down on his throne. They say that's no longer 1914. And number two, they're saying the separating of the sheep and the goats is also a future event. Then comes the November 1st Watchtower that we just looked at, and this redefines the generation that will not pass away. The Awake magazine then comes along and drops the thought that the end would come within the lifetime of the people that saw the 1914 generation. And it changes this to a wicked generation with no set time attached to it, a floating wicked generation that doesn't really nail down any time period. Well, this is really a very important point to deal with Jehovah's Witnesses on, because a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses are going to be upset by this change. After the 1975 prophecy failed, 1 million people left the organization. The 1975 prophecy was just part of this one. They said the generation started in 1914, it would end in 1975. If you remember the Truth book, that's the one I studied when I came into the organization. It's reproduced on the back cover of this booklet. They actually show a picture of a Bible where it says last days, and they have an arrow that starts at 1914. It says within one generation, and it comes over here and lands on the other side. That's the end. Well, it was specifically pointed out as 1975 for a while, but they dropped that after 1975 passed, but they continued this same prophecy within the generation that saw the events of 1914. So this is very, very significant. You can imagine that right now there are a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses who are having trouble over this problem. They're facing this, they're looking at this new truth they got in their magazine, and they're thinking, there's something wrong. Now, they're not saying it to one another because they'd be turned in by one another. You're not supposed to say something's wrong. But you can be sure that there are probably well over 1 million Jehovah's Witnesses right now who are worried about this, disturbed by it, and upset about it. So if you're going to talk to Jehovah's Witnesses about anything in the coming months or even in the coming year or two, this would be probably the thing to start off talking about. Because Jehovah's Witnesses are worried about this. They can't deal with it. I remember being a witness myself when they came out with new truths that contradicted old truths, and it was upsetting. You know, we didn't go to the Kingdom Hall and say, I got a problem with this. But my wife and I talked to each other about it. When we realized that we would have to stop talking to people that we used to talk to, when we realized we have to cut off relatives that they said we shouldn't talk to, and then in 1974 they came out and said we should, and then in 1982 they came out and said we shouldn't, well, that was upsetting. Well, this is going to be upsetting to Jehovah's Witnesses, especially those who are serious about the preaching work, serious about what they were doing, serious about the fulfillment of prophecy. Now, the Watchtower Society is going to try to squeeze wiggle out of this and say, well, we're not a false prophet. We were just overly eager for Christ's return. They're going to try to make this out as if it's something commendable for them, that they were eager to see Christ's return, and so they would come out with these prophecies. In fact, they're going to try to say that this definition of a false prophet in Deuteronomy 18:20 through 22 does not apply to them. That's not us. No. I mean, they'll say, well, that couldn't be us because we're sincere Christians. We were just trying hard to anticipate Christ's return. Well, let's look at that prophecy. Now, does this make them a false prophet? Well, they said, no, we made a false prophecy, but it doesn't make us a false prophet. I mean, it's just like saying somebody committed a murder, but they're not a murderer. Well, the scripture in Deuteronomy 18:20 through 22, that scripture in Deuteronomy says, a prophet proclaims in the name of the Lord. It says that what a prophet proclaims in the name of the Lord does not take place or come true. Well, obviously the prophecy didn't come true. It didn't take place. In fact, that's why the society stopped making the prediction, because it was false. It didn't come true. So they stopped saying that. But now here's the key point. Was the prediction spoken in the name of the Lord? This is where they're going to try to wiggle out of being a false prophet. Now we know that it was spoken in the name of the Lord because they said in each issue of the Awake magazine it was the Creator's promise. They didn't say this is our promise, this is our interpretation, this is our best guess. They said this is the Creator's promise. And back in 1942, in the January 1st, 1942 Watchtower on page 5, it said this, quote, those who are convinced that the Watchtower is publishing the opinion or expression of a man should not waste time in looking at it at all. And further on that same page, they said, those who believe that God uses the Watchtower as a means of communicating to his people or of calling attention to his prophecies should study the Watchtower. End of quote. So that 1942 Watchtower makes it very clear that when they published prophecies, they were saying it was not the opinion or expression of a man, it was God communicating with his people and publishing his prophecies. So they were speaking in the name of the Lord. They were speaking in God's name. Well, they tried to wiggle out of this again in the March 22nd, 1993 Awake magazine. On page 4, they devoted a lengthy discussion to showing that they were not a false prophet, even though they had made false prophecies. And this is how they tried to get out of it. They said in one very brief sentence, they said, never did they say, these are the words of Jehovah. So that's very important in the Watchtower's excuse. They say, we may have said it was the Creator's prophecy, we may have said these are God's dates, we may have said God speaks his prophecies through the Watchtower, but in that Awake of March 22nd, 1993, which the witness will probably pull out, never did they say these are the words of Jehovah. Well, there's only one problem. This 1914 generation, they did say these were the words of Jehovah. It's found in the 1984 Awake magazine, or Watchtower magazine, rather, that's pictured here on the cover of the booklet, the May 15th, 1984 Watchtower. And I'll read directly from the photocopies of the pages that are documented right here in the booklet. This is, it's on page 22 and 23 of the booklet, but the important thing is it's the May 15th, 1984 Watchtower, pages 6 and 7. It says, quote, from a purely human viewpoint, it could appear that these developments could hardly take place before the generation of 1914 disappears from the scene. But fulfillment of the foretold events affecting the generation of 1914 does not depend on comparatively slow human action. Jehovah's prophetic word through Christ Jesus is, this generation of 1914 will by no means pass away until all things occur. Luke 21:32. But that isn't all. Continuing the same quote without any interruption, they go on to say, and Jehovah, who is the source of inspired and unfailing prophecy, will bring about the fulfillment of his Son's words in a relatively short time. So this is all one paragraph here in the Watchtower. They're saying that this 1914 generation prophecy is Jehovah's prophetic word. And when they quote the scripture, they say this generation, and they put in brackets of 1914. That's right there in the Watchtower. That's not a bracket that anybody inserted to comment on what they were saying. That's what the Watchtower put in. They said that this is Jehovah's prophetic word through Jesus Christ, that this generation of 1914 will by no means pass away. And they're identifying this as, they're saying that Jehovah, who is the source of inspired and unfailing prophecy, will bring about the fulfillment. So this is the most serious statement that they've ever made about any of their prophecies. This goes beyond Russell saying that these were God's dates. This goes beyond the 1942 Watchtower saying that God was communicating his prophecies to his people through the Watchtower. Here they've specifically, in one paragraph, said that this prediction about the generation of 1914 is Jehovah's prophetic word, it's inspired, and it's unfailing prophecy. This is the most serious false prophecy the Watchtower Society has ever made. So when they say, never did they say these are the words of Jehovah, they can't say that anymore, because that's what they said about this false prophecy that failed. And they go on in that same page, if they start to say, well, that didn't mean this and that about the generation, well, it's right there on the same page. On that same page 7 of the May 15th, 1984 Watchtower, they say, just as Jesus' prophecies regarding Jerusalem were fulfilled within the lifespan of the generation of the year 33 CE, so his prophecies regarding the time of the end will be fulfilled within the lifespan of the generation of 1914. And at the bottom of the page they say, yes, you may live to see this promised new order along with survivors of the generation of 1914, the generation that will not pass away. So this is all right on two facing pages of the Watchtower that you can easily have on one large piece of paper here. That they said it was Jehovah's prophetic word. They said the generation that saw 1914 would not pass away. They said that this prophecy is inspired, it's unfailing, and it will be fulfilled within the lifespan of that generation. So this is a very serious matter. Now, that you can emphasize for Jehovah's Witness after bringing this information out, a witness is going to be just really terrified to hear this. But it's fulfilling something that they're thinking inside their own minds. They're already upset about it. Thinking witnesses already know that this is a false prophecy. Thinking witnesses already know the society said this was the Creator's promise. They may not remember that May 1984 Watchtower, though. That's why it's important to show them that they said it was Jehovah's prophetic word. That makes it even more serious. Now, after bringing this information out, then you can go on to show that this was a repeated offense. The Watchtower didn't just make a mistake and make a false prophecy and say it was Jehovah's prophetic word. This is a repeat offense. They published this over and over and over again in their magazines. Here documented, we have the October 15th, 1980 Watchtower on page 31 when they said, yes, there was a generation of people that was living in 1914 and that saw the major historical changes. We can be happy, therefore, for Jesus' assurance that there will be survivors of the generation of 1914, that this generation will not have completely passed away when the Great Tribulation rings down the curtain on this wicked world system. You can turn to the May 15th, 1984 Watchtower that contains that statement that it was Jehovah's prophetic word. On the previous page, page 5, they show that they had actually looked at what Jesus meant by generation. See, that's what they're trying to claim as the new truth. They've looked more closely at what Jesus said was a generation. They've gone back to the Greek. Well, now they understand it right. Well, they went back to the Greek back then, and they understood it right, they thought. According to page 5, the Watchtower, that same Watchtower of May 15th, 1984, they said, Jesus used the word generation many times in different settings and with various meanings. But what did he mean when he spoke of a generation that would not pass away? Well, they said a generation is really related to people and events rather than to a fixed number of years. Well, that sounds like what they're saying now. But then they continued on that same page, and they made it very clear. They said, the babies of that generation are now 70 years old or older, and others alive in 1914 are in their 80s or 90s, a few even having reached 100. There are still millions of people of that generation alive. Some of them will by no means pass away until all things occur. So they made it very clear that they had looked at what Jesus meant by a generation. They knew that he used the term differently in different places, and they say this is what he meant here in making this prophecy. Well, the society continued repeating over and over again that prophecy. There's many references here listed to it where they've had time to think about it, they've had time to see if they made a mistake, but they've repeated it and repeated it and repeated it for years and years and years. But not only that, this wasn't the first time they made a false prophecy. Well, we document here that they had previously talked about the generation, and they talked about it back in studies in the Scriptures. And this time they said, on page 604 of Studies in the Scriptures, Volume 4, they said the gathering time beginning October 1874, the organization of the kingdom and the taking by our Lord of his great power as the king in April 1878, and the time of trouble or day of wrath which began October 1874 and will end 1914. So they're saying that that was the generation. They actually identify it as a generation. They suggest that the generation that would see the end was about 100 years long. It started in, they actually trace it back further, and they say that it would end in October 1914, and it included 1874 when they believed that Christ returned. Well, then on the next page, page 605 of Volume 4 in Studies in the Scriptures, they give an alternative rendering, an alternative interpretation. And this alternative is the generation was 36 and a half years long, and that it was the generation from 1878 to 1914. So both interpretations still end up at 1914. So the society has reinterpreted this before. It's just a running reinterpretation by a false prophet who used this statement about the generation to come up with 1914, then they used it to come up with 1975, and now they've most recently used it to come up with the generation that saw the events of 1914. Well, a number of other false prophecies can be documented. They predicted about 1925, they predicted about 1975. We can go on and on. But this is the starting point to talk to Jehovah's Witnesses today. If you could start talking about the Trinity, you could start talking about other false prophecies or different subjects, but those things aren't going to be on the mind of Jehovah's Witnesses. But if you start talking to a Jehovah's Witness right now, this is going to be on their mind. They're buzzing about this. This is going around the Kingdom Hall. This will be the big thing for Jehovah's Witnesses for quite a period of time. So you can start out with this point about the generation of 1914, prove that the Watchtower Society is a false prophet, prove that they've got repeated offenses as a false prophet, and therefore the witness should not be afraid of them. God has condemned them. And of course, the important point to go on to from that is that this organization is not the way and the truth and the life. Turn to the Bible. The way and the truth and the life is Jesus Christ. Jesus is the one who warned us against the false prophet. So since the Watchtower is a false prophet and is not the truth, then the witness does have to turn to someone else to find the real truth, and that truth is Jesus Christ.